Welcome to the Boris Institute Zoom webinar on globalization. Where do we go from here? The world has become interconnected as never before. The interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, populations, together with the explosive growth of the internet as a medium of communication and commerce, have brought the world closer together than ever. And yet globalization has created a host of challenges confronting modern society, including economic inequality, increased fragility of democratic institutions, the rise of authoritarian regimes, the need to improve social welfare and justice, and the challenges both of preventing and treating pandemics in an interconnected world. Marshall McLuhan coined the term global village 6 decades ago, and if anyone has any doubts, the COVID-19 pandemic has hammered the point home. We're all in this together. So good evening, shalom to you all. Without further ado, it's my honor to ask Dr. Boris Mintz, the president of BMI, the Boris Mintz Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions to Global Challenges at Tel Aviv University, to deliver his opening remarks. Boris.
Thank you very much. My pleasure, everybody. I'm glad to welcome the participants of our meeting, outstanding speakers, and all those who joined us at this hour. Today we are holding the first session aimed at forming a modern global agenda. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed fundamental problems in governance system, both at the national and international levels. The inability of government institutions to adequately respond to modern global challenges became evident. In our opinion, one of the main reasons for this crisis of governance is the lack of adequacy of the existing global agenda to combat modern challenges. There is a need for a scientifically based assessment of global challenges, and on this basis, the formation of priorities for the development of civilization. I see our task in forming an appropriated agenda based on a deep professional discussion and evaluation. At the same time, I am convinced that if we base said an agenda on the priority of universal values, on comprehension that humanity must unite in its goals, only then can we find the right answers to the modern global challenges that are coming at us, preserving human civilization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mintz. It's now my honor to ask Professor Ariel Porat, the president of Tel Aviv University, to address us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to open this webinar. I want to greet you all, the participants, and also the audience for taking part in this important webinar. So it is about the challenges of globalization, and naturally, since I'm the president of the university, I would say a few words about globalization and Tel Aviv University. Maybe some of what I say are applicable, I believe, are applicable also to other universities, definitely in Israel, but maybe also in other places. I would, of course, be very brief because these are opening remarks. So here are a few points that I hope might be relevant to the topic for today's topic. So even before the pandemic, Tel Aviv University has a very important strategic goal, which is to advance globalization of Tel Aviv University. At Tel Aviv University, every year, about 2,000 international students study in different programs at the university. And our goal is to at least to double the number in the next few years. When I say to have double the number, it means to have more students studying in undergraduate programs at the university in different areas. I mean also to have more students than today that participating in master programs and also PhD and postdoc students. So globalization meaning many more international students studying at Tel Aviv University. But it's not just about students, it's also about professors. So we want Tel Aviv University wants to advance or to encourage faculties and schools at the university to bring visiting professors, many more than what we have today, to all departments, to be part of the Tel Aviv University community. We are open and we encourage even short visits, knowing that it sometimes might be burdensome or even impossible for professors at other universities to come for a year. But we are very eager to attract professors from all over the world, from top universities, top schools, to come and stay with us, to be part of the community. So we already have visiting professors here, but we want to have them in much higher numbers, and this is something we want to encourage and even to subsidize in order to make it easier for faculties to do it. One of the obstacles or at Tel Aviv University, so if we want really to be a global university or much more global than what we currently are, we would be very eager to attract not only Israelis or Israeli professors staying in other countries to come to the university, although that by itself a very ambitious goal. So Anat Admati, for example, right? So of course, we would be very happy to have Anat, just for an example, right, as a visiting professor, but she is an Israeli, and the chances to bring Anat to Tel Aviv University is probably higher than to bring someone who is not an Israeli and even not Jewish, right? So unfortunately, if you look at the faculty, not only at Tel Aviv University, but also in other places, you would not find many non-Israeli, non-Jewish professors as part of faculties at Israeli universities. And I think this is a shame. I mean, there are all kinds of barriers which are not necessarily dependent on what the university do. It's much broader issue. But again, if you really want to be a global university, an international one, there must be a solution also for that, right? That professors from all over the world would be able, if they want to come to Israel and to be part of the community, either at Tel Aviv University or in other universities. Tel Aviv University also has many ongoing teaching or research programs with other departments or other universities abroad. Let me give you a couple of examples. So recently we launched a new joint program with Columbia University for liberal arts, life sciences, and entrepreneurship. And according to that program, students study 2 years at Tel Aviv University and 2 years at Columbia University. So it's a joint program. Many of the students are Americans, other students are Israelis, and there are also international students coming from other countries. So this is a model that we want to duplicate and to have more such programs together with leading universities abroad. One more example, at the law school, for example, we have a joint program with Berkeley. So the law school at Tel Aviv University and the Berkeley Law School has also joint program where Berkeley professors and Tel Aviv University professors teach students for the LLM. The students are mid-career lawyers in their mid-career or judges, and this is a very successful program for many years. Ideally, we would like that all departments or all schools at the university would have such programs with leading universities abroad. Could be on either teaching or research, and we of course have some programs of that type, but we want to have more. So this is also part of the globalization of the university. So to summarize, what I've said until now is that globalization meaning many more students in all degrees, many more joint programs with leading departments or leading schools at leading universities abroad. And we are in a process of establishing more and more such a relationship. We have another new program that we try to do with Colombia and the United Emirates on healthy aging, which is a very hot topic now in almost all universities. All top universities are dealing with aging and healthy aging, and future of aging is a very major topic in many places. So we are about to launch a program, also a research and teaching program with University of Columbia University and the university in the United Emirates, which is another progress that we hope to do in the next year or so. Finally, as you know, today leading universities, mostly in the United States, but not only in the United States, establish or try to establish campuses in other countries. Tel Aviv University also has such an ambition, although we try to be modest and not to do what NYU has done in Abu Dhabi, which is fantastic, but beyond our size, right? To have a campus like entire university, this is not something we want to do at the moment. But at the same time, having a mini campus or a kind of an extension of the university in a very focused areas, this is something that we explore. So just for an example, we have an opportunity to do something like that in Florence, and we are in the process of exploring this possibility. So it might be that in the next few years, Tel Aviv University would have, still not sure, but it's possible that Tel Aviv University will have an extension in Florence, probably liberal arts and entrepreneurship, and who knows, maybe later on we would have some other such initiatives. Now, so this is generally about different channels of or different directions that we want to take. Let me just mention one more thing, which indirectly I believe also relates to globalization, which is multidisciplinarity. Tel Aviv University is one important strategic goal of the university is to exploit the comprehensiveness of the university. You know, at Tel Aviv University, you can find almost all fields, any field of knowledge you can think of. There is such field of knowledge at Tel Aviv University. And one way to exploit or to, to create added value from this comprehensibility is to create connections between the core sciences, exact sciences and life sciences, and social sciences and humanities. In recent 2 years or so, we established several multidisciplinary centers, which combines almost all fields at the university. Just to illustrate, one of such centers is AI and data science. Again, in the core, you have scientists doing AI and data science with links to the entire campus. Another one that we established about half a year ago is combating pandemics. We all know that combating pandemics is a multidisciplinary matter. It's a multidimensional. It's not just about biology, and almost any field of knowledge has something to do or to say about a pandemic. So we have such a new center. There is another one that we are about to establish in a week or so, which is about climate change. Again, it's a multidisciplinary center. And I mentioned before the aging or the future of aging or healthy aging, which is going to be another multidisciplinary center in the university. And there are some other ideas. So this, I believe, at least indirectly, also relates to globalization. I think that that's what comprehensive universities, a state-of-the university, should do. I think it also increases the attractiveness of the university to foreign students, also to foreign professors, and to creating programs or joint programs with universities abroad. And so to summarize, the challenges of globalizations are everywhere, and including at universities. The pandemic, although the reasons why a university should go in directions that I mentioned existed before the corona. It has not been invented recently. Still, I think that at Tel Aviv University, and I believe also in many other places, some of the need to globalization becomes more salient, and if people were not sure about where to go as to globalization, I think that many of us understand now that it's more urgent than ever. So again, I want once more to thank you for taking part in this webinar. I look forward to hearing the very interesting lectures that we have on our menu for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Porat, and we'll have a short question and answer session at the end of each of our 2 sessions. So if you have a question, please post it on the Zoom chat and try to keep it short. Now, to open our discussion on economic institutions in the 21st century, let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Manuel Trajtenberg, the head of INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies, to talk about incentives and institutional change, reforming the legislative process in the Knesset. Professor Trajtenberg.
Oops. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I don't know exactly what time zones you are. To all of you, I presume that Anat is early morning there. I want to thank Dr. Mintz and Professor Itai Sened for organizing this conference on such an important and timely topic. In the course of the last decade, we have seen a series of major challenges to what's called normally the world order, a Seder Haolami in Hebrew, both between nations, superpowers, and within nations. I won't expand on the challenges to the world order in terms of the superpowers. We are aware of that. That's not the topic today. Now, the world is still under the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Luckily, not us in Israel. We completely forgot about it. The Hamas helped us forget about the pandemic. We were attacked by missiles and not by a virus. You know, I don't recommend it either way. But in fact, for us, that's over. But the pandemic for everybody has exacerbated some of these challenges. The pandemic has magnified existing problems and accelerated major trends. Now, the challenges are in a series of areas, but particularly in the political area and in the economic area. In Western democracies, we have seen challenges to the institutional pillars of democratic regimes. We see that with fake news, with the foreign tampering in elections, political polarization. Think about it for a moment. In Israel, we may be about to embark in a 5th round of elections. I hope not, but we had 4 in a row reflecting polarization. It was 0-1, and you know all about what. We have seen the rise of populism everywhere, literally everywhere. I mean, there are very few countries that have escaped that. We have seen the loss of restraint. I mean, democracies are based not just on rules, but also on the principle of restraint, that we don't abuse the powers that the Constitution or the laws may give you, that you know where the limits are. We have seen that those limits have been, transpassed. We have seen the shrinking of traditional political parties. Think about it. I mean, in almost every Western democracy, the traditional parties play a minor role, and other parties that didn't exist before play a major role. In the US, the Republican Party is very different today than it was before Trump, also the Democratic Party. So there are major changes. And in other countries that had at least some trappings or semblance of democracy, we have seen the erosion of basic democratic mechanisms. That we see that very clearly in Turkey. We see that very clearly in Russia. Now, in the economic arena, the rise of the disappointment with growth is very pervasive. Economic growth used to be kind of the main target of economic policy, because we economists and others with us thought that if only the economy will keep growing year after year, then things will be fine. But they're not fine, because big chunks of the population don't benefit from growth over time, and that creates frictions within societies. We have seen a tremendous rise in inequality in the Western world, and we see a disenchantment with globalization. And oftentimes, people talk about globalization in a very general, diffuse way, and ascribe to globalization many of the economic ills that we see. I'm not going to go into that. I mean, it's a perception. Globalization, in the purely economic sense of the increased the transactions in goods, in services, in capital, in everything, in the last 25, 30 years, is a big part of it, but it's not only that. And we have seen instability, the fragility of financial institutions, and so forth. All of that points to the urgent need to rethink what we call economic institutions, and not just economic, but in general, the institutions that govern both the political system and the economic system. Institutions have become a major topic of research in economics, because we understand that the institutions are those that determine the rules of the game, both in economics and in the political arena. And it seems to be that those rules of the game are not matched well with the trends and the phenomena that we see these days. Now, by the way, this need to rethink institutions happens with a frequency of about once in a generation. So, I hope that we will be able to do something about it, that it will last at least until our grandchildren, our children will have to rethink their own institutions. So let me zoom in to Israel, and let me zoom in to one particular institution, the Knesset, as a case study. And the reason I'm going to do that is to exemplify with that a general idea that I think should be applied in a more general way. And what's the idea? It's very simple. It's almost trivial. That institutions, as in politics, in economics, and the players within, the actors within institutions, respond to incentives, and that the rules of the game that govern institutions determine those incentives. And so if you see an institution that is not functioning well, ask yourself, what are the rules of the game that determine the incentives, that determine the behavior of the actors in those institutions that we think that they are wrong in some sense, okay? So what I'm going to do is to briefly describe that for the Knesset. So why the Knesset? Well, I think that I shouldn't explain to you that in Israel, the political system is not functioning well, and that's an understatement. I mean, we are in the midst of a protracted political crisis that is lasting for 2.5 years or more. We don't see the end of it. And, you know, one can say that it's due to this or that personality. I say that there is something more fundamental here. And the Knesset, the Knesset is perceived as an institution that instead of contributing to alleviating the crisis, in fact, is doing the opposite. We see that in the numbers. I mean, the public trust in the Knesset is at a historical low, something like less than 30% of the public, of the general public, think well of the Knesset, and that's very detrimental for the workings of democracy. And the Knesset, in the way it's, you know, the public sees it, has contributed to polarization and to political instability instead of doing the opposite. So I'm going to take advantage of my own short experience as an elected member of the Knesset, an experience that lasted for 2.5 years. And fortunately, I'm out of it, but I learned a lot. And I want to put that knowledge to work in terms of thinking about rules of the game and incentives. So what I realized during my tenure at the Knesset is that, as I said, that the behavior of members of the Knesset, MKs, respond to incentives, and that the rules of legislation that are prevalent in the Knesset on close examination, they provide the wrong incentives to MKs. So that's kind of what I'm going to examine. So I wrote a paper about it, and I'm not going to expand too much, but just give you some key elements in it to perhaps to tease your imagination and perhaps your interest in this. So as you know, in Israel, we don't have a constitution. We have a few so-called basic laws that are not so basic in the sense that oftentimes they are challenged and even tampered with according to political necessity. And we had just that happening this very week, okay, when the Supreme Court gave a yellow card, as it were, to the government, actually to the Knesset, saying, hey guys, you know, this basic law that is not really a basic law was used for political purposes, and you are debasing the very notion of a basic law. Now, new legislation in Israel, any bill that is put in front of the Knesset, in order to approve it, you need just a simple majority, even 2 members of the Knesset against 1, that's it. The law is approved. That's true also for basic laws. Think about the paradox of it. A basic law can be approved by a simple majority in the Knesset. Now that's kind of something that really contradicts the very notion of what a basic law is. Let me give you another piece of information that to understand why things are not, in what way things are not working well. There has been a flurry of private draft legislation in the Knesset. In the 20th Knesset, the Knesset that we are now in the 24th, I think. In the Knesset, the last Knesset that was there for 4 years, from 2019, 15 to 2019, there were 6 6,000 private bills introduced to the Knesset. 6,000. How many of them were approved? 4%. But the very fact that you had so many draft bills introduced in the Knesset, it's a debasement of the notion of legislation. And, you know, to the public, they understand that this is not serious. And it has become, it's like, you know, it's like devaluating the currency. So the currency of legislation is being devalued when you have so many private bills introduced and only 4% approved. Another manifestation of the fact that the Knesset is not working well is that the so-called debates in the plenum of the Knesset, not in the committees, in the plenum of the Knesset, which is what the public sees because TV is there. These debates are typically nothing short of a circus, really. And when you think about it, there's a reason for that. And that's because that's almost the only way that MKs can get notoriety, public attention, you know, 1 minute of fame in the news, and so forth and so on. So there's something very wrong about all this. And what I claim is that this can be affected by changes in the rule of the game. What we propose is to create a measure of the degree of consensus that led to the passing of any law. It's a formula which is a positive function of the number of votes in favor and a negative function of the opposing votes. And it's an index that goes from 1 to 120. It's related but not necessarily to the number of MKs. So if a law is approved and this index, say, is very high, it means that it gained a lot of support from the Knesset and very few opposed it. And the opposite is if it gets a very low value. Now, and here's the point. What we propose is that each MK will receive at the end of each term in the Knesset a grade, a ranking that will be the average of these measures of consensus of the laws that he or she have drafted. Okay, so if you get a low grade, it means that you may have managed to pass laws in the Knesset, but they are really by a very small margin, very few approve of them, and you know, many oppose it. Okay, if you manage to get a high grade, it means that you command consensus, that what you have done is, in that sense, appeals to the middle ground, because that's what, how do you get support from parties, from members of the Knesset that are by necessity not only on one side of the political spectrum. So if you do that, you are providing a strong incentive, A, not to propose junk bills that never get passed, because that doesn't contribute to your grade. B, it gives you an incentive to seek approval, wider consensus for the bills. But if you seek wider consensus, then you have to convince other members of the Knesset. And to do that, that may lead to more substantive discussions and less polarization. Furthermore, the idea is that once you get this measure of consensus, this number, okay, attached to each law, then you establish that to make any change in the law in the future, it will require a consensus measure that is no less than the one that it received during its approval. So if a law receives a consensus measure of 80, okay, that you can get it by saying that 80 supporters and no opposers, okay, then that means that in order to change it, you will need to have at least 80 supporters and nobody disapproving it. So that in itself will create a ranking of laws that are passed with a low consensus. You can change them easily. They are less important. Laws that are passed with a higher margin of consensus, well, you know, you will need more consensus in the future to change them. We propose also additional measures that should accompany this change in the rules of the game. One is to set limits to the number of private bills that can be introduced by HMK each term. That's, what I propose can help in that, but it's not enough. You need an additional constraint of that sort. By the way, in many countries, in many parliamentary democracies, there are such limits. In Israel, in the Knesset, we don't have it. Second, we suggest that you should have set up quorum requirements for debates on laws, quorum requirements for voting on laws. Because again, you see, the idea that you can pass laws with 3 members of the Knesset present at the time of the voting is a debasement of what the legislative process is meant to do, okay? And thirdly, we propose to limit the power of the so-called Government Committee on Legislation. Let me explain a little bit and I will stop because I'm running out of time. The government sets up, every government, a committee made of some of its ministers, and it's usually headed by the Ministry of Justice, that they review all the draft legislation before they are discussed in the Knesset. And they review it and they come up with a decision to support it or to oppose it, okay? If they oppose it, the coalition opposes it because they impose coalition discipline, okay? So in fact, what happens, think of it for a moment, is that the separation of powers doesn't exist. I mean, the government, actually a subcommittee of the government decides what legislations will be considered and eventually approved or not, and not the Knesset itself. I think that that's an aberration of the notion of parliamentary democracy, okay? And it has consequences, again, because the members of the Knesset that are not in the government, they feel completely frustrated by that fact, okay? Because what are you? I mean, if you are in the opposition, you don't have any chance in any case. If you are with the coalition, but you're not in government, again, you have very little influence because the government is going to decide which bills are introduced and which are not. So this is a kind of a set of proposals to change rules of the game. What are the chances of that happening? Well, don't hold your breath. But I think it's very important whenever we consider institutions, whenever we consider the challenges to institutions, the problems that they face, think of it in terms of rules and in terms of the incentives that those rules present to the players, to the actors, and therefore to the behavior of those institutions. I'm always optimistic. I think that we can do a lot in that respect. I think that we in academia, in think tanks, we have an obligation, a duty to think through these challenges in those terms, not in the terms that politicians think about it or the general public. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And from Professor Trachtenberg to Dr. Trachtenberg, we now turn to Dr. Nadine Baudot-Trajtenberg, the former Deputy Governor of the Bank of Israel, to talk about globalization and the free flow of capital. Time to reconsider. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I had a problem with my own connection, so I'm also listed as Professor Manuel Trachtenberg under my name. I'll focus much more on the impact, particularly on the policy impact that we must think about in this era of globalization. First of all, let me say a few things about how I understand economic globalization and how it has expanded, particularly over the past 4 or 5 decades. All of that expansion of globalization, reaching every time something else, has been based on one idea only. And the idea is that, and of course it's an idea that economists particularly are fond of, is that you should reduce barriers to movement, whether we're talking about price barriers, as in the case of tariffs, for instance, regulatory barriers in some other cases, and so on and so forth. This reduction of barriers has been a movement, really a global movement that has touched first and foremost the trade, of course, in goods with the reduction in tariffs and in quotas, then the reduction, of course, of tariffs and the barriers on service in this, in the service area. Then I would say about 20 years after that, we started seeing what was called the liberalization of the capital markets. And the liberalizations of capital market at international level was again a reduction of various barriers for the free flow of capital in and out of countries. And this, I think this free flow of capital, or this expansion of globalization, was important to accompany the globalization in trades and services, but in itself, it is also a globalization of capital services that we've seen. And that occurred, I would say, more massively in the past 20 years. I'll come back to that because this will be the focus of my talk. And in some cases, we've also seen the reduction in barriers even of people. And certainly in the case of Europe, and the ability now for people to travel from country to country pre-corona to work has also been a reduction in barriers. And in general, if you think, for instance, about what was required 40 years ago in terms of visas and bureaucratic processes when you were traveling around the world, that has also dramatically diminished. Now, all of this, this expansion of globalization, first on goods and services, then the capital market, and a bit on people, the reason this was pushed forward so forcefully is, of course, because the promises of reduction of these barriers and these friction to movement was that we were going to have a better allocation of resources. This was going to increase economic growth. This was going to increase productivity. And I think there's no doubt that indeed it contributed to the growth that we saw during the past 40 years. When we think, for instance, and it contributed for lifting a very large part of the world population from below, from within extreme poverty to above that level. If you think in 1980, about 47% of the world population was living in extreme poverty. By 2019, we were at less than 10% that is living in extreme poverty. So clearly there was something, there is something behind that idea that clearly gave very positive element on growth, on productivity, and so on and so forth. But we're increasingly aware, of course, of negative externalities, and particularly in the area of climate change, for instance, but these are not the externalities I want to focus on. Let me focus a little bit on the globalization of the free flow of financial money. Now, this is, again, this was a great promise, and to a certain extent it has delivered. Again, the ability for countries to be able to tap savings of another countries in order to grow, the ability for people to distribute the financial risk they're taking, to allocate capital where presumably the returns or capital are going to be higher. I mean, that was the promise, but it also with it brought many challenges. And these challenges and this will relate a little bit to what Manuel was saying earlier, these challenges must be met by the economic, particularly the political, but particularly the economic institutions. And I'm not sure they have yet met these challenges. One of the challenges of this globalization of capital flow has been tax avoidance or tax evasion. And in fact, during these past few days, we're seeing a great effort led by the United States, but also by the OECD community to try to have a more uniform taxation structure to limit this tax evasion and tax avoidance that we've seen that was greatly facilitated by the globalization, by the free flow of financial capital. Another challenge has been financial stability, and I will want to spend more time on financial stability and in general the conduct of monetary and financial policy. This issue of financial stability, by the way, if you look at which countries have mostly reduced their barriers to capital, this roughly started in the 90s, and it's been first and foremost the advanced economies that have reduced these barriers to capital. In fact, emerging markets have been initially started also on the liberalization of their capital market, but they have been much more careful and I think much more reluctant to completely open up their capital market or to allow completely the free flow of capital in and out of their country. And perhaps it's not surprising given the repetitive financial crisis that were in part created by these massive flows of capital. Recall the Asian crisis in 1997 with a massive inflow of capital going into Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, South Korea, and then very often this massive inflow of capital in fact, instead of going to really productive financial assets, end up going and building financial assets bubbles, which eventually lead us to a financial crisis. So that, so recall, I mentioned the Asian countries, but of course the repetitive South American crisis have been in great part, I think, not necessarily created, but certainly exacerbated by the very fast movement of very large flows in and out of capital. Of course, the global financial crisis reached around the world. And even the repair of the global financial crisis could in itself impact negatively. If you remember a few years ago, in 2013, what was called the taper tantrum, it was the United States was about the very expansionary monetary policy, was going to just the US signaling that they may be stopping this very fast expansion, scared off financial capital away from emerging markets and created in many of the emerging market countries some mini financial crisis. So no wonder these countries have been much more reluctant to continue to open up their financial markets, and in fact have kept and sometimes added even some friction to this to these flows, whether in or out of the countries. Now, the interplay between the financial economy and the real economy has been, of course, at the center of macroeconomics ever since John Maynard Keynes. And I'm not going to talk about all of the channels through which the financial markets impact on the real economy, but there's no doubt that it impacts greatly. I want to touch on one particular issue. When we think about financial markets, we think of markets that move extremely fast, that adjust very fast, Not only do prices change very rapidly to an increase or to a decrease in demand for certain products, for certain asset class. I mean, these are markets which we see adjusting instantly all the time. Massive amount, very quick adjustment. But the real economy doesn't adjust that quickly, okay? If whatever real market we're talking about, whether it's a product market or whether it's the labor market, the adjustments there are much more slow than what we see in the financial markets. So the interaction between a very quick and sometimes very fickle market impacting on the real economy, the channel through which it does, often it starts to have one impact one way. By the time the real economy turns around adjusting to that environment, the financial flows are back out. So there's a timing almost inconsistency that makes it very difficult for real markets to be always in line and aligned with what the financial conditions are telling us. This is in part what the monetary authorities in various countries try to do, is to try to manipulate to a certain extent the financial conditions in order to make them appropriate for the real market. Whether the real economy is in need indeed of wind behind the sails, or whether the real economy in fact should be slowed down because it appears to be growing too fast and creating inflation. This is one of the issues that these days we're all talking about. And here, the dominance of the US has been massive, of course, and it still is today. Not only because most of the financial flows around the world come and go to the US, but it also because of the dominance of the dollar, not only in the financial markets, but also in the real economy. So the US is a huge economy in the world. It's much more important when you look at the financial markets. The size of the US asset market, financial market, is much, much larger than if you look at the size of the US economy and the world economy, which is not surprising. Think of yourself when you want to buy stocks, for instance. You want to buy stocks around the world, but you will find yourself with a much larger amount of US stocks because that is what is available on financial markets. So the US economy might be a third of the world GDP, but if you think of stock market, it's more like 60% of the stock market. So you're going to have an overweight, if you want, exposure to the financial markets in the United States. So monetary policy in the US is important for the rest of the world. So it's not surprising that everyone watches and listen to whatever the chairperson of the Fed might be saying or hinting, or should we be reading between the lines to see what they're about to do, because this will affect the rest of the world. And of course, monetary policy in the US is geared to the US economy. Okay, it's the mandate of the Fed to adjust its policy according to what's happening in the US. But it has as a side effect a massive impact on financial markets around the world, as well as on monetary policy. Even though, for instance, the Israeli economy could be in a different situation than the US economy, it's going to be very difficult to have a monetary policy that is going to be very different than that of the United States. If the interest rates are very low in the US because there's a need for that, it's going to be difficult for any country around the world to have high interest rates because they think they have inflation, because this will have a very large impact, of course, on the exchange rate, which may even create a financial crisis, and so on and so forth. So the role of the United States has been very important. And for the past decade or so, and it's not only because of the United States, certainly the crisis in Europe added to that, and now the coronavirus crisis around the world is adding to that, that we are now living in a world not only where interest rates are very low, but where the returns on returns on our money forces us to take an increasing amount of risk. An increasing amount of risk, and there is one particular area where I think the free flow of capital has been quite detrimental, and we've been seeing this in many countries around the world. I mentioned that this interaction between financial markets and real market is at the center of macroeconomics. And this is a market that moves massive amounts of money and very quickly. And this is often a market that is slow to react, depending also on political institutions. An important real market is the housing market. And the housing market everywhere is slow to react. It doesn't matter whether you're in the US or in the UK or in Israel or almost anywhere in the world. When there's an increase in the demand for housing, you cannot increase the supply of housing very rapidly, okay? There's there's regulatory hurdles, bureaucratic hurdles, not to talk about the fact that it takes a long time to build a house. It's not like moving capital flows around. And if we look at, and housing is an asset class, so it gets bid up just like stocks or like other as the financial flows move around. But housing is also a service to individuals. Okay, so it's two things. And if we look at what happened at housing prices around the world during the past 20 years, even including the housing crisis and the global financial crisis that reduced prices in many countries. So even with that drop, you still have housing prices in the US in real terms 50% higher than where they were 20 years ago. In the UK, it's almost 100% higher than where it was 20 years ago. In Israel, it's about 70% higher than where it was 20 years ago. In Canada, 168%, and so on and so forth. In most countries, we've seen, because of a combination of these very rapid flows, very large flows of income moving around, and of course, the role of the central banks, and particularly the central bank, of course, in the US and in the ECB, of massive amount of liquidity injected, so very low interest rates. We've seen housing prices around the world growing. So I started by saying that one of the wonderful things about economic globalization is that if you look at extreme poverty, over the past 40 years, we've seen a dramatic drop in extreme poverty. On the other hand, what we're seeing now is an increase in housing poverty. There has been an increase in income. It has not been, not only it has not been as large as what we've seen in the increase in the housing prices, but we also know that a lot of that increase in income, of course, went to the upper tier of the distribution of income. So we increasingly have, in many places around the world, we have a housing crisis. And and that's true not only in advanced economies, it's also true in emerging market economies. So when I think of policymakers, so there's two things we can think of. Should we introduce friction in this, in these allowing of free flows of capital in order to avoid too much money, for instance, flowing into the housing market, bidding up prices, and it will take a very long time, we know, for the real market to increase the supply. So should we increase friction in certain areas? I'm not sure. I'm not completely against friction. I think in some cases we should probably reintroduce friction. But another things we should do is that we should think also of policies that are going to be targeted to the market. For instance, the housing market. I mean, I wouldn't suggest a policy that would be targeted on the tomato market, because tomatoes are not that important. But the housing market is such a huge part of individuals' well-being that I think that in that case, we should indeed have policies that are both fiscal and monetary policy, introduce friction in the capital market for housing, and introduce policies that will allow also people to have affordable housing. And this policy changes, I think, has been needed for a while, and we have yet to turn to that. So thank you. I think I will stop here.
Thank you so much. And our last speaker on economic institutions in the 21st century is Professor Anat Admati from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, who will talk about capitalism, law, and the need for trustworthy institutions. Professor Admati.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And the first for me to be on a panel with my very good friends, the Trachtenbergs. So that's unique and special about today. And I would like to pick up threads going all the way back to Professor Porat, President Porat, because whereas I'm a financial economist, and here's Nadine, financial market, mention them briefly, my interests now lie a lot in the law and in politics. And so I want to put together a little bit, a short narrative. And the title that was given here just at the time we were planning this was coming from a short essay I was writing that where a bunch of people, mostly economists, who were asked the question, capitalism, what has gone wrong, what needs to change, and how to fix it. We were supposed to fix it in, a few thousand words. Of course, even the word capitalism is not even easy to define, and different dictionaries define it differently. Sometimes it's just defined as not socialism, not communism, just who owns the means of production or whatever, this whole debate. And sometimes it's defined in terms of markets, free markets, competition, prices, all of that. And in that Washington consensus, the neoliberal capitalism, and there are now a lot of adjectives, neo-capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, shareholder capitalism, etc. There is this sort of notion that it's either the government over there or the market over there, like there's a conflict between them, instead of understanding that, in fact, you can't even talk about one without the other. And there is no market without contracts, without rules, without the kinds of things that Manuel was talking about, the institutions, and who makes decisions, and what do they know, and what do they want, and all these governance problems in all institutions, private sector and government sector. And then the devil being in the details of the kinds of things Manuel specifically focused on in this one institution called Knesset, etc., which is sort of how do you make people have the right incentive to do the things that we need in society. The capitalism that we have in the Western world, and that global capitalism that we're talking about, I call it financialized capitalism, and I, as a finance professor and somebody who's looked into banking, lament greatly the bloated and increased role of financial markets over a lot of things, over governance of corporations, which chase financial metrics as their objective, and the narratives built around the way governments interact with corporations. Now, So my interest, I commented from corporate governance, and so my interest is in institutions called corporations, which we study in sort of corporate finance, corporate law, but which also interact with other laws. And so corporations as institutions are actually creations of the states. They are legal people created by the states, and more in the global world, we often in economics, which is also a dismal science I now have become a little bit more cynical about, so that the fact Manuel was saying economists are interested in institutions, well, not really. I mean, they're still interested in markets, and these institutions are players in markets and black boxes that we don't look enough inside or in their political interactions with the rest of society. In other words, corporations are political people as well as economic players. So they are political agents, and they play within legal systems. Not only do they play within legal systems, but they shop legal systems. And Nadine was referring to tax evasion. Indeed, they shop jurisdictions for all kinds of things, for the contracts, for the enforcement, for the incorporations of them and their subsidiaries around the globe. So in the global economy, global corporations have significant power, often tied to, in international relations, another subject in the social sciences, tied to powers of governments, their home governments in particular, which is why a lot of global corporations are actually sort of, based in certain places, mostly the US again, and it is from their home countries that they derive or collaborate in the global political arena. My diagnosis of what was wrong with what I call the intertwined crisis of capitalism and democracy today is that capitalism as practiced on the ground has undermined and overwhelmed the ability of democratic institutions to deliver for their citizens. And as a result of that, we have a deterioration of democracies because the power has moved to the private sector, to both wealthy individuals, but also especially to institutions in the private sectors, corporations, who on one hand, in some respect, compete, but on the other hand, actually call the shots, tell their governments what to do, threaten governments, and just deplete governments of resources or competence or ability. And so in the end, the bottom line is that the reason we're here has to do with incentives all across the system and with narratives and fundamental confusion and even deception that makes that creates an inability to gather up political wills in democracies to kind of straighten the power structure and balance the power structure between citizens, so societies, government institutions, democratic government institutions, and economic players that exist and should abide by rules of society as embodied in laws. And so basically, we have too much kind of corporate freedoms, you might say, and too little people power in democracies. And that's kind of the problem. And there are narratives that maintain this and make it difficult to change. Until we diagnose the problem more correctly, it's going to be harder to fix it. And the fixes will include, creating trustworthy institution. I called it, and I will only say that trust is a matter not just of saying, trust me, where I like to show a slide saying, trust me, and behind it lie the word, I'm lying, because I've met a lot of, I'll say BS, but a lot of bad arguments and narratives along the way that people promote because they just make assumptions and the assumptions are false, but they refuse to question them. So I think first we have to get our facts and our diagnosis together, and then there's much to do to fix democracy and capitalism and make the markets work better, financial and real. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And before we start our second session, just one short question to Professor Trachtenberg from Tal Sadeh, who says, won't restricting the amount of legislation proposal risk alienating the public?
Well, I don't think so. Actually, the public feels alienated, among other things, because they observe what happens in the Knesset, and what they see is what I said before. It's that these legislation bills introduced are, in Hebrew, they are called. It's a play of words that I will translate. There are Atzaot Chok, which is law proposals, and they call them Hatzarot. Again, the law are not Atzaot. They are declarations and not really a proposal. So the public understands that, and they relate to it accordingly. So instead, I think it's the opposite, that if we limit the number, the public will understand that this is more serious. Introducing 6,000 bills in 4 years, it cannot be serious, and the public understands that.
Thank you for that nice answer. And now we begin our second session on Is Democracy Sustainable? The Future of Democratic Institutions. And I'm pleased to call on Professor Itai Sened, the Dean of the Gershon H. Gordon Faculty of Social Sciences and Head of BMI, to talk about political institutions and the rise of the new right. Professor Sened.
Thank you all for coming. I will change the rules of the game when I try to when I actually use presentation. It will not be a long presentation, but it will take a second to come up, and I apologize for that.
I think they need to give us hosting rights, Itai. I have a presentation as well. Could Eilat?
You have Simon. You have hosting rights by definition as being a panelist. So you can actually, whenever you choose, you can join, and that's what I just did. So just like Anat, I'm very happy to be here with Simon and John, very wonderful close friends from years past. I would like to emphasize that the presentation that I have prepared for this meeting is based on the work of my PhD student, Karen Omansky, a very recent graduate of the Boris Institute, who is now at Potsdam in Germany doing a postdoc. And the reason why I use the presentation is because I'm going to refer to something that many of us mentioned before, and has a very troubling mathematical logic to it. And so when we come to mathematics, graphs do better than words, and in my mind at least, better than equations. So there is a very, in my mind, a very big reason for concern when we talk about the future of Western democracies, and Anat and Professor Trachtenberg, Dr. Trachtenberg have all mentioned the importance of stable political institutions. And as political scientists, we have been watching political institution with some sense of wondering, because we've always wondered why are they actually more stable than they seem to have to mathematically. And underneath this observation was the very famous median voter result, which seems to give us some of the explanation and seemed to have worked very well during the 20th century. And in unidimensional political environments, everybody converges more or less to the center. It has been a very well-known, well-established theorem, usually associated with Duncan Black, but not only. There have been others, Hotellings and others, who have contributed to the same result, and there have been extensions. And the result has been very robust over the years to show that, and it is true not only when you have two parties, it is true for many parties, and it is based on a very simple logic that shows on this slide, that if you move to the left of the center, you earn less than 50% of the support of the voters, and the same if you move to the right. And so everyone is trying to converge to the center and get a chance at least of winning a majority. And of course, in the end, it's a tie. And when Manuel Trachtenberg mentioned that it's kind of been a tie for 4 consecutive elections, it's like, tell us something we don't know. It's true in the United States. It has always been true in the United States, and in England on and off, and in many other countries, because that's the way politics works. But in a recent, not so recent anymore, in a book by the late Norman Scofield and myself, 2006, we have pointed out that these centripetal powers or forces are countered by very powerful centrifugal forces. And we have discussed those niche parties that can find local maxima in places other than the center of the distribution of the voters, simply because in multidimensional arenas, the central parties do converge to the center, but they do leave someplace in the periphery of the distribution of voters for smaller parties. And we gave a different example, actually different examples from the United States, from England, from Israel, and other cases. Italy was a big case we discussed there. But in our work and in the work of many others during that time, these were referred to as niche parties. They were not regarded as troubling the stability of the system as such. And over the last 10 years, we have noticed that this is probably no longer as clear as it used to be. And the work of Karen Umansky was trying to figure out why those niche parties have become so influential. And her own concept that she put together on her own was the idea of the legitimate enemy, the tendencies that she observed in many European countries to pick up on some enemy that you create, then you legitimate the hatred toward this enemy, and then you create havoc. And the examples are many and well-known. Immigrants, the EU, governments, institutions, the old regimes, the new regime, you name it. But for me, it was kind of a challenge to see what have ever happened to the median voter result and to those exceptions of niche parties. Why don't they hold together? And so we set up ourselves to take 3 case studies. We made several case studies, but this is, I'm going to present the results of three that just to show the issue of what is going on. And the first one is Austria, the 2013-2017. And here I need to just very briefly mention a concept that I don't need to explain very much. It's a very complicated mathematical concept called the uncovered set. And the uncovered set is just the result of the policies that parliaments will tend to converge to. And I will not explain it further because it's not necessary. Now, in the 2013 election, we see that a convergence of possible policies in Austria to this star, the blue star, that not surprisingly sits exactly between the SVO and the OVP. And that's kind of like the median between the two large parties, dominant parties, that are ruling the Austrian political arena. And that's where it is. But in 2017, we see that the set of feasible outcomes under the new elections of 2017, the yellow cloud is a much larger set. Actually, it's a pretty large set. The figure here is a little bit misleading. And it's very much, and the figure here doesn't show it very well, but it's very much anti-immigration. So what happened here? And what happened here is this FPO. FPO came into the game. It's a kind of a nationalistic, anti-immigrant party. And the troubling effect that they had, they came in 2013, but no one was paying attention to them. They're way too far anti-immigration, and they were so extreme that no one was paying attention to them. In the 2017 election, the OVP gave them a little bit of a fight, and so they moved closer to attract more voters, and they didn't attract that many voters, but they ended up moving the set of feasible outcomes way to the anti-immigrant spectrum. And more importantly, they created this instability that everyone before me talked about that is so dangerous for the economics of nations. So that's, again, in the limit of time, this is kind of a brief discussion of what happened in Austria between 2013 and 2017. And then, of course, we go to the other dimension, and we see the same thing. And here the legitimate enemy is, of course, the European Union. And again, the move of the FPO has not gained the FPO so many votes, but it took, and here you can see that the previous equilibrium, if you may, the uncovered set is basically the equilibrium policy outcome, is exactly the median between the SPO and the OVP. But then what the FPO was able to do, mounting a huge anti-EU campaign, was to take the uncovered set away into the anti-EU and make the set of feasible outcomes much larger. And again, Manu talked about the 4 election or 5 election in Israel. Austria went through its own series of electoral campaigns to get this one sorted out. Next, the same analysis, and again, the analysis is very, very complicated in terms of what do we do and how do we get to these results. And I don't want to bore you, and we don't have time. But in the UK, we see something even more extraordinary. Of course, the 2010 equilibrium result, again, the blue star, is between Labour and the Conservatives, pretty much kind of more or less between the two parties, closer to the Conservative for reasons that we all know, I don't want to get into. But then we see that UKIP in 2010 was not presenting such a big deviation from what everybody was talking about. They were talking about anti-EU, but it wasn't big, it wasn't critical yet. But then in 2015, as everybody knows, they took it to the extreme. Now, UKIP barely got a seat in the English Parliament, but they created this move of the Conservatives wanting to fend off the attack from the UKIP and the EU. And everybody remember the details of the event with Cameron calling for a large memorandum on this opposition to the EU and the famous Brexit. The main thing, again, without going back to all the history and the details of the events and how they followed, he, of course, eventually ruined his own political career. But the bottom line is that a tiny little party, barely getting a single seat in the English Parliament, is actually moving the equilibrium point not a whole lot, just enough to get the Brexit approved. And once again, it was approved by, Simon remembers the numbers better than I do. It was really a fraction of the votes that voted for the Brexit. And all of a sudden, and speaking for the economics of it, we live in a different world. The world before Brexit and after Brexit, both politically and economically, is a very different world, and the instability introduced. And all of this has happened due to a tiny little party that has disappeared since, pretty much, or almost. Last but not least, I want to show you the result in Germany. Now, in Germany, we have the same thing happening. And we have the usual CDU and SPD. And the 2013, 2017, we have the kind of the mimicking the UKIP. We have the AFD. They, of course, use immigration as a legitimate enemy. And they create the same effect, the same move as in the UK, from the blue star to the red star. But here, the final outcome didn't change much. And we have to ask ourselves, why was the English, the oldest parliamentary democracy in the world, was so easily moved? And the final outcome was so harsh, as opposed to the German case, where we see a very similar movement, but with no consequence so far. Now, of course, people will mention the name of Angela Merkel. It's clear that this is part of the answer. But as we sit here trying to think of what to do with the imbalances and instability of institutions, I pointed out more the questions than the answer, but I wanted to highlight the fact that this is generic to the system, and conclude with pointing out that until the end of the 20th century, the so-called chaos theorem was a mathematical ingenuity of basically Scofield and McKelvey. Okay, they're geniuses, interesting enough, but it wasn't happening. And all of a sudden, in the 21st century, it is happening, and we are ill-equipped to deal with it. And the conditions that matured, that made it happen, are the simple fact that new dimensions, too many new dimensions, were introduced into the political system. The multidimensionality of space, of the political space, became real, and all of a sudden, tiny little parties realized that in multidimensional spaces, you can much more easily manipulate the space, going back to my mentor and hero, of course, William H. Riker, who has seen it coming a long time ago before us, but now, many years after he unfortunately passed away, it is happening. One thing that we may look for an answer, or one place where we may look for an answer as to what to do about all of this is Germany and why it remains stable. And of course, except for Merkel, who is a big part of the answer, maybe high threshold rules could help. Maybe Manuel's idea that we should restrict what can or cannot be raised or brought up in Parliament could help. But we certainly need to figure out mechanisms to deal with this very potent reason for concern. So thank you very much. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much. I guess you should close the screen, Professor.
I am closing it. I am.
Thank you so much. And now to discuss fragmenting democracy, let me introduce Professor Simon Hicks, the Harold Laski Professor of Political Science and Pro-Director of the London School of Economics. Professor Hicks.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much, Dr. Mintz and colleagues. Thanks, Itai. I mean, what I'm going to talk about actually follows on really nicely from what you were talking about there, Itai. Not surprisingly, one might say.
Not surprisingly.
So what I'm going to talk about is a new project I'm involved in, which we're calling Fragmenting Democracy. And the project really is looking at the fact that, of course, we've all identified various crises of democracy. There's been a lot of talk about, trying to explain the rise of populist parties or the rise of authoritarian values amongst voters or declining trust in politicians, media echo chambers, democratic deconsolidation, and so on. Yet we haven't looked at what I think is one of the outcomes of a lot of these factors yet, which is a return in a sense to some classic issues in political science and comparative political science. And Pravorsky puts it very nicely in his recent book on crises of democracy. Party systems that endured without change during almost a century are eroding. These systems survived not only the turmoil of the interwar period and World War II, but also the profound economic, demographic, and cultural transformations of more than 40 years following the war. But the traditional party systems are crumbling. To give you an illustration of that, this is data on the effective number of parties. So if you like, the number of political parties in a democracy at the voting level, so at the electoral level, not at the parliamentary level. In 14 continuous democracies in Western Europe since 1945. I mean, I've got data from everywhere across the world, and of course in Israel, you're very familiar with this trend. But this is a trend that is existing everywhere. If you like, in Western Europe, we're increasingly referring it to the Dutchification of European politics. In fact, the Netherlands now, I think at the last election, had 18 parties elected into parliament. And you've seen, there's the trend across all of those countries. In fact, if you roll back to the 1950s, the average number of parties in Western democracies was less than 4, and now the average number of parties is around about 6. So we've seen over a 50% increase in the number of parties. This transforms how we think about democracy and how democracy actually works. One aspect of this is polarization or pluralism, rise in support for the radical left and the Greens on the one side, but also rise in support for the radical right. So these are the average vote shares of these different political forces across 14 different countries in Europe. And what you can see is that part of the story of growing fragmentation is growing polarization. So it tends to be a declining support for the center left as they lose votes to the more radical left and the Greens, and declining support for the mainstream right. And if you look across that, what's remarkable is the median voter. If you think about what Itai was just talking about there, the median voter has been pretty stable across this period. If you think of it just as a single sort of left-right dimension, what's happened is the left-right balance hasn't changed, but growing fragmentation within that balance as a result of growing polarization. We talked a lot about what's been driving polarization, but we haven't actually talked about one aspect of that, which I think is growing fragmentation. When thinking about this, clearly what is going on is increasing electoral volatility. So this is, we've increasingly got very nice data from election studies in many countries to look at how voters switch their votes from one election to the next. We've heard a lot about volatility of voters from the allegedly from the mainstream left to the populist right, with sort of former working class or post-industrial voters voting for the radical right. But actually, when you really study vote switching in elections, what we find is that voters are going everywhere. It's not true to say that there's just one sort of trend, which is rising support for the populist right, and these voters have come from the mainstream right or from the mainstream left. In fact, as this shows from the last German election between 2013 and 2017, you can see voters coming in all directions and voters also going in and out of non-voting. So what we're seeing is a huge pluralism and fragmentation across the political space. It's not as linear as I think some of the claims that people have made. One question I think seriously to be raised is, are we seeing a general de-alignment of the old party systems that we had? There was a big debate about de-alignment in the 1970s, and then party systems sort of stabilized in many countries. Is this a second great de-alignment we're seeing? Or is this the beginning of a new realignment? The idea that the old traditional parties, so Labour or Social Democrats on the left and Conservatives or Christian Democrats on the right, those parties are gradually being replaced. They're being replaced by new political movements, a sort of progressive liberal movement on the left and a more populist nationalist movement on the right in various forms. And what we're just witnessing is a sort of interregnum while this shakes out. So if you think about politics rotating from a traditional economic left-right round to what is now a sort of cultural conflict between globalization and nationalism, and we're in the midst of how that plays out. Of course, we're seeing that in Israel, the Israeli Labour Party down to around about 6%. Or 7 or 8% of the vote in Israel, down from a party that was once getting close to over 30% of the vote for many years. And it's the same in many countries across the Western world. Questions we don't really have answers to yet, I think, are what are the underlying causes of this fragmentation? Various different claims are out there. One is this is relating to growing inequality. Inequality in society, economic inequality feeds through to political inequalities, feeds through to political polarization. Polarization leads to growing fragmentation. Another aspect which I think has been less discussed is growing social heterogeneity. As we've seen growing transformation of our economies and societies as a result of globalization, we've seen far more pluralist social groups in society. We've seen a fragmentation of the working class. There's no longer the idea of a kind of lumpen proletariat. The working class is hugely varied. It's hugely varied in terms of its interests, hugely varied in terms of also its ethnicity. When you think about the fact we're all immigrant societies, or many of us are immigrant societies now, also growing heterogeneity in terms of gender roles in our economy. So in general, the economy and the society we have now is far more pluralist and heterogeneous. And wouldn't you expect that heterogeneity to feed through into political heterogeneity? And is that in part what we're seeing? We're seeing a breaking up of those old socioeconomic class structures and the formation of a new politics that reflect, in a sense, politics is catching up what has happened at the level of our societies over the last 20 or 30 years. At a sociocultural level, there's also a lot of other things going on, of course. We've seen growing media pluralism. We've no longer seen the kind of dominance of one or two major media outlets. We're seeing social media, transformation of the world of political information and political news. We're seeing a transformation and a pluralism of social preferences in society, a growing number of issues arising that don't fit into a standard sort of left-right issue space. Immigration is one, of course, but we can think about gender, we can think about Black Lives Matter, we can think about trans rights becoming issues in many different places. These are very difficult to think about how these issues fit traditionally into standard party politics. Also, localism is becoming a huge issue, with local issues not fitting into national issues, and I'll come back to that in a second. Overall, I think what I would say from growing socioeconomic heterogeneity and growing sociocultural pluralism is what we're seeing is an increased dimensionality of the political space. I mean, we used to think in one dimension, some of us thought in 2 dimensions. Itai can manage to think in 3 dimensions. Maybe it's 4 or 5 or 6 dimensions. And sometimes those dimensions collapse easily into 1. Sometimes they collapse into 2. Sometimes they don't collapse at all. And this does increase the kind of chaos of the political process. Institutionally, we're seeing declining party identification. We're seeing increased party failure, where leadership failure, and voters not being tolerant to stick with political parties if they fail. They're treating voting much more like shopping, i.e. I tried you at the last election, it failed, I'm going to try somebody else in this election. And this fits with this growing personalization of politics. We're seeing the change in the media structure is also feeding through to a change in the way politics works. It's not that people identify with particular political parties, they identify with particular individuals. If those individuals are successful as party leaders, they're supported. If they're replaced by somebody else, voters who support that person may decide to go and vote for some other party. We don't know, however, whether this fragmentation is largely between political blocs or within political blocs. I suspect there's far less between bloc fragmentation or heterogeneity than I think is often been suggested. Some of the electoral volatility data suggests that, but other electoral volatility data suggests we're seeing growing fragmentation within the sort of progressive center-left and growing fragmentation within the center-right. So we're seeing sort of center-right switching votes with a more radical right and then gaining votes back as the center-right becomes more authoritarian. And we're seeing the center-left switching votes with new green or liberal left or progressive left forces on the left, and again gaining those votes back as they sort of reposition. I'll come back to that because I think that gives us some answers when thinking about what we might do institutionally to address some of this fragmentation. And that a little bit varies by electoral system. Another aspect of this is the difference between what is going on at the local level and what's going on at the national level. So this is some data from Matt Shugart from the UK. And if you focus on this period here, this is quite interesting because what you see is, so here this is the average number of parties in constituencies across the UK. And this is the average number, the effective number of parties at the national level, right? So the point is there's a gap. You get fewer parties on average in each constituency than you do at the national level. So what that is telling you is you get different parties in different constituencies. So you don't get the same parties competing in each constituency. In fact, what happened between 25 and 2010 is particularly interesting because at the district level, the average number of parties went down, but at the national level, the average number of parties went up. So what's going on there is you're seeing growing geographic heterogeneity. So it's kind of captured by this figure here, which shows, so this is from 1950 to 2019 in the UK, the percentage of seats where Labour and Conservative were the top two parties. So if you go back to the 1950s, almost every single constituency in the country was Labour versus Conservative. Roll forward to 2010, only 40% of constituencies in the UK were Labour versus Conservative. The rest of them are something else. Labour versus Lib Dem, Conservative versus Lib Dem, Labour versus Scottish National Party, Scottish National Party versus Lib Dem, Plaid Cymru in Wales versus Labour, and so on and so on. And even some places, Green versus Lib Dem and Green versus Labour. So we're seeing growing geographic heterogeneity. And if you get that geographic fragmentation of the vote, even in a sort of British type electoral system, that gradually feeds through to a national level heterogeneity and becomes very difficult for any party actually to form a majority. The Conservatives did it in the last election. This was largely, I think, because this was a particular election, a Brexit election, if you like. But I think the norm in the UK going forward is going to be minorities in the House of Commons as a result of this growing geographic fragmentation of the vote. So in general, we think that fragmentation, democratic fragmentation, is bad for democracy. As you've seen in Israel, it makes government formation increasingly difficult. It increases political and policy chaos. I mean, Itai already introduced the concept of chaos. I think this is exactly what's going on. You're seeing this cycling of policy or cycling of voters or cycling of preferences leads to very difficult for voters to coordinate, to try and work out who should we be coordinating from one election to the next because there's such uncertainty about election outcomes. This feeds through to declining clarity of responsibility, meaning it's very difficult. One of the core ideas of parliamentary democracy, we as voters choose parties, they form governments, we hold them to account for what they've done in government. But if you can't predict what the government's going to be, and if the government becomes very unwieldy with many, many parties in it, it's very difficult for voters to hold that government to account. It's very difficult to replace it. It's very difficult to know who to blame. One of my favorite examples of this is in the UK. We had one of the only examples of coalition government we've had between 2010 and 2015, sorry. We had the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. And Nick Clegg has written a very interesting book about the coalition in the UK. And one of the things he says is one of the things he was most upset about after the 2015 election, when David Cameron resigned from politics. David Cameron was asked, what are the things you're most proud of in government? And he said, I'm most proud of raising the threshold before people pay tax, subsidizing low-income kids in schools, and introducing gay marriage. And Nick Clegg was furious because he said all of those three things were in the Liberal Democrat Party manifesto and none of them were in the Conservative Party manifesto, yet David Cameron can claim credit for them. And so that's what happens with just two parties in government. Imagine, and you know in Israel very well, what happens when you get 4, 5, 6 parties in government. Anything good, the party that's the prime minister claims it. Anything bad, they blame one of the other parties. This leads to declining clarity of responsibility. It makes it very difficult for voters to hold governments to account. And you can see then how this fragmentation leads to a political backlash. Increasing polarization of preferences leads to fragmentation in the party system, leads to voter frustration that leads to more polarization, and so on and so on. And you can see a kind of negative loop that feeds through to this crisis in the party system. I mean, this crisis in the party system, I think, feeds through generally to broader political instability, broader economic uncertainty, when people are holding back investment because they're uncertain about what policies are going to happen, what politics is going to happen. You can see that is then feeding through to economic instability and economic uncertainty. But if this is the world we live in, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic. What's interesting when we look at public opinion of voters is voters actually like more choice. So all across democracies, it's a lot of younger voters who are saying, I like the fact there's more parties for me to vote for. These are voters who treat elections as consumers. And they like the fact there's a party out there that's very close to their political preferences. And so that's the party I'm going to vote for. And they don't want to compromise. And so it's interesting that at the sort of at ballot box level, voters seem happier than they've ever been. But in terms of the government performance level, voters seem more upset and frustrated that they've ever been. And so I think some of the answers to how to solve the problem are going to come from whether or not this volatility is mainly within bloc or between bloc. If the volatility is within political blocs, so within the sort of center left, within the center right, this, I think, suggests that we should be thinking about trying to encourage broad pre-electoral coalitions, a sort of center-left coalition, a center-right coalition. It's starting to emerge a little bit in Israel. We're seeing it very strongly in Sweden and Denmark. This leads to greater accountability and clarity of what's going to happen. The other thing I find very interesting, there's suggestive evidence that if you have open list electoral systems where voters can use their vote to select individual candidates, this actually allows these pre-electoral coalitions to hold together quite well, because the voter can actually vote for an individual member of a particular party within a coalition. So the voter, in a sense, is able to express their preference for a bloc, as well as their preference for an individual party within that bloc, as well as their preference for an individual politician within that bloc. So in a way, what you're doing is allowing for the choice that voters want, the kind of freedom to choose that voters like, but constraining the sort of institutional level fragmentation. And I think if we can move towards that sort of design of how democratic elections work, I think we may lead to the fact that instability of the party system does not necessarily mean instability of government. So that's all I've got for you. Happy to answer questions and get into the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Hicks, for that fascinating talk. Our final speaker in this section is Professor John Kerry from Dartmouth College, who will speak on confidence in elections and pro-democratic reforms. Professor Kerry.
I just want to jump in. First, thank John for joining us. It was a huge juggling of meetings and before meetings and after meetings. And at the same time, apologize that I will not be able to stay until the end of the meeting. I will hear most of John's talk. I wouldn't be able to miss it for the world, but I apologize that I will have to leave immediately after. Thank you for joining, John, really.
It's great to see you, Itai, even if only briefly. Thanks for inviting me. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
So I'm going to speak about what it says here, how deep is support for American democracy, and particularly about electoral confidence. I'll move pretty quickly through my slides and invite you later to ask me to go back, and I'll give you an advertisement for some slides that I won't show you up front, but I can if you want to see them in the question and answer. This first slide just is to instill confidence that I'm working with other people whose reputations are more solid than my own, and you should trust my results. This, all of the data I'm going to show you is from a team called Bright Line Watch that I work with. It includes Gretchen Helmke, Brendan Nyhan, and Susan Stokes.
Sorry, can you open it on full screen?
I'm in full screen.
Maybe swap display.
Let's see. Is that
On the top left?
top left? Swap displays. Sorry. That's better, huh?
Good, thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, so first slide here, I'm just going to show you this team has been surveying both samples of the American public, representative samples, as well as a sample of experts, which is political scientists all throughout the United States, for the past 4 years. I'm going to show you something first that won't surprise you at all. One of the questions we've asked is about, we've asked people to rate the quality of American democracy on a 100-point scale. And what you can see here is that actually, so this is starting at the beginning of the Trump administration up through the early days of the Biden administration. You can see that, first of all, pretty stable evaluations. The line in purple is the line of the entire representative sample of the American public, pretty stable line. The line in green is of our experts, who tend to be slightly more optimistic about American democracy than the American public is. And then the line in red is Trump supporters, and the line in blue is Trump disapprovers. So it's just dividing our public sample into those who approve or disapprove of the job Trump was doing as president. So you can see stability throughout most of this period. But if you look at these last 3 iterations of the survey, the first of those took place in October, a couple of weeks before the last general election. The second one took place in November after the general election. And the third one took place in early February, right after Joe Biden's inauguration. And what you can see, of course, is that in that time, the Trump approvers and the Trump disapprovers switched places. There had been about a 10-point gap between them in terms of their evaluation of American democracy, and that swaps when Biden becomes president. One of the other things you notice is that the experts, who are basically almost all Democrats, see a similar kind of improvement to what the Trump disapprovers did. Okay, nothing surprising there. Now, let me just suggest that a basic core proposition for stable democracy is that those who lose elections need to accept the result. Right? This is one of the first lectures we give to our first-year students in course on democracy. Corollary to that is that political leaders on the losing side need to signal that the outcomes are legitimate. Right? If you want the losers to accept the results, their leaders need to signal that. Now I want to look at some responses to a question about whether, now we're just looking at the public respondents, okay, just an American sample. Confidence that your votes were counted as intended at both the state level and the national level. And we're looking at just those last 3 surveys that I mentioned, October and November of 2020 and February of 2021. If we look at the October, this is the pre-election survey, you can see there was no difference between Trump supporters and Trump disapprovers. But you see this big jump after the election, in which disapprovers have increased confidence and the Trump supporters decline tremendously. So whether this becomes an existential threat to American democracy, I think really depends on what happens in the next few years. And I want to talk a little bit about some signals that we have about that next. Okay, next slide here looks at this same question, okay, confidence that votes were counted as intended by the local government. Now I'm breaking my sample up. On the left-hand side, you have the public sample, okay? This is the same sample we've been looking at so far. Now it's divided between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, which really largely corresponds to that Trump approver and disapprover breakdown. On the right-hand side, we've got a sample of local government officials that we also surveyed at the same time. This is in February of 2021. The people in this sample are state legislators, mayors, critically election administrators. We're going to be keeping a close eye on electoral administrators over the next few years. county commissioners, sheriffs. So all kinds of, we have dozens of different local offices in the United States. That's who's in this sample. We look at Democrats. Now we're thinking about February 21, Biden has been inaugurated. We can see at the county level, at the state level, at the national level, both among state officials and among the public, we see huge levels of confidence. Among Republicans, and I'm going to skip independents, you can see they basically fall in between, but among Republicans, we see much lower levels of confidence in the electoral, in the sort of integrity of elections overall. We see less confidence the further you get from home. So people tend to be, more confident in what happened in their county than in what happened in their state, and even less confident at the national outcome. You're probably familiar with the way, the idiosyncratic way in which we aggregate election results at the national level in the United States. But then the other thing we want to look at here is the difference between the public sample and the sample of local government officials. Republican local government officials show much more confidence in the integrity of elections than do the Republican rank and file, but not that much greater, right? So if we look here at the levels for the national outcome, you see we're at about 48% of Republican national officials. It's just short of a majority, express confidence. That's twice as high as the 24% among the Republican base, but they're both really distressing numbers. And what we're going to be looking at in the next few years is the pressure that those local electoral officials are feeling from their base. And the current manifestation of it is to profess belief in the big lie, the lie that the 2020 election was stolen. So the key dynamics that we're going to be watching for in the next few years are, first of all, pressure from Republican partisans on their legislators and their local officials to violate democratic norms regarding elections. I'm going to talk a little about that if you want. And conversely, pressure from Democratic partisans on their legislators, particularly at the congressional level, to play constitutional hardball. So what do I mean by these things? With respect to norms regarding elections, I primarily have in mind, first, the idea of a state party, because most of our election law operates at the state level in the United States. So a state political party making it more difficult for members of the other party to cast ballots. Local electoral officials refusing to certify election results that reflect recorded vote totals. And then both of those things could operate for any election, but these last two I put a box around because they're really going to operate with respect to the presidential election only, and of course the next one is coming in 2024. A state legislature approving electors to the Electoral College other than those designated by the popular vote in that state, or, and this is what was at issue last January 6th, Congress refusing to certify presidential election results that have been submitted by the states. These are things that were pretty much unthinkable in American political history, pretty much from the founding until just recently. And they have recently come directly into play and directly into uncertainty. The other elements of constitutional hardball that I mentioned before, I'll summarize them quickly here. I'm talking about, but by constitutional hardball, I mean things that are technically within the rules of the game, but that violate generally accepted norms of political procedure. And the degree to which they violate accepted norms is an open question. One such strategy would be gerrymandering electoral districts. Another that is on the agenda now and may become more so in the next couple of years would be granting statehood to Washington, D.C. and or Puerto Rico, which would change the balance of power both in the House of Representatives, but even more importantly in the US Senate. Abolishing the Senate filibuster or reforming how it operates. Ending the Electoral College, just to say moving to electing the presidency by popular vote. The most straightforward way to do this would be by amending the Constitution, but that's no one thinks that's really feasible. There are some other workarounds that are possibly in play that could get us to an effective election by popular vote. They would be highly controversial. Adding seats to the Supreme Court in order to change the partisan balance of the justices. The flip side of that is Senate refusal to confirm judicial or cabinet nominees from a given president. Presidential removal on grounds of unfitness. This came up during Trump's presidency when people talked about the potential use of either the impeachment mechanism or even the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which is a more obscure mechanism for removing the president, not because of criminal acts, but because of the perception of unfitness. And the last one, which I put up here, and it's not really constitutional hardball, it'd be unconstitutional hardball, but it would be actual secession and breakup of the union. And I know that I've got limited time, so I'm going to skip through survey results that we've got on all these others and just close with showing you some quick survey results with regard to secession, because I think these are kind of shocking, but they also give, I think, a sense of the degree to which the United States is divided right now and to which people are willing to entertain previously unthinkable solutions. In our February survey, we asked people, would you support or oppose your state? And so we knew which state the respondent was from, so we were able to pipe their own state into their survey. Seceding from the United States to join a new union with, and then we would pipe a list of other states that would join a prospective new union with their state. We broke the country up into 5 groups, and you can see the groups of states that we lumped together here. And there's a group in the Northeast, there's a group in the Southeast, which is basically pretty much the old Confederacy from the 19th century. There's a group in the Heartland, or the Great Lakes region, a group in the Mountain region, and then a group on the Pacific coast. The overall support that people expressed in February, remember this is right in the wake of the insurrection on Capitol Hill and so forth, overall support was 29%, which I found to be enormously high. Of course, this could be cheap talk. You know, we're not asking people to take a risk or to pay any cost to do this. But what's really striking to me is also the regional differences. So what you see is it is true that support is generally higher among Republicans than among Democrats. But in the 2 regions of the country where Democrats predominate, in the Northeast and in the Pacific region, support for secession is actually higher among Democrats than it is among Republicans or independents. The highest level, when we break down by partisans, was among Republicans in the old Confederacy of the South, which is kind of ironic if you know a little bit about American history. The Republican Party didn't used to be regarded as a hero of the Confederacy, but that's a longer story. But we see really striking regional differences, and this was surprising to us, and I think telling about the depths of divisions we're seeing in the country, both regionally and by partisanship. So I'll stop here because I want to allow time for discussion, but I'll give you just an advertisement of some additional things I could show you if you want to ask. One is we've done a candidate choice experiment to try to tap into willingness of our public respondents to vote for candidates or not based on whether that those candidates supported or opposed Trump's impeachment in February, earlier this year, and of their support for what I'm calling the big lie, which is the idea that the election was stolen from Trump. 2020. We've also got survey results on support for those constitutional hardball strategies that I had listed in a previous slide. We've got some support for alternative political systems, military rule, expert rule, things like that. I've got some expert survey support for specific institutional reforms to our representative institutions, and also finally some survey results on willingness to condone political violence. But I don't have time to go through all of that, of course, and I just wanted to give you a sense for what this research group has been trying to learn about in American politics, and I'm happy to talk more about any of those topics. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Carey. That was really interesting, and connected very well with Professor Hicks's talk, and also with Professor Sened before that. I think this, you'll all agree that this has been a wonderful discussion on a very important topic. For those interested, there will be a recording on the website of both the BSI, the BMI, the Boris Mintz Institute, and jpost.com, the Jerusalem Post website. And if there's any one who wants to talk, and now would be a good time before we conclude, would anyone like to say anything among the panelists? So unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and especially the Boris Mintz Institute and Dr. Mintz for hosting this fascinating webinar. We hope you all enjoyed it, and thank you for joining us. Until next time, Shalom from Jerusalem.